In 1981, the Federal Bureau of Investigation did something that seemed impossible. One man spent 6 years deep inside the American Mafia. His name wasn't Donnie Brasco. That was just the fake name he used. But the friendships he made, the murders he saw, and the criminal group he helped destroy were all terrifyingly real. This is the complete story of the greatest secret mission in FBI history. A story of lies, loyalty, and a man who had to choose between both. Before we start this amazing true story, I want to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Are you relaxing after a long day? Maybe it's late at night and you're looking for a story to fall asleep to. Write your city and the time in the comments below. And if you love true crime stories, mafia stories, and deep dives into the criminal world, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is going to be a long one, so grab your headphones, get comfortable, and let's travel back to 1970s New York, where one FBI agent was about to disappear into the darkness. If you enjoy this story, leave a like and share it with someone who loves gangster history. Now, let's begin. Joseph Dominic Pistone entered this world on September 17, 1939 in Erie, Pennsylvania, during a time when America was still recovering from the Great Depression and the storm clouds of World War were gathering over Europe. He was born into a working-class Italian-American family, the kind of family where hard work wasn't just valued, it was expected, demanded, and honored as the only path to a better life. His parents had moved from Sicily, bringing with them the old-world values of family loyalty, respect for authority, and a strong work ethic. They spoke Italian at home, cooked traditional meals, and kept the customs of their homeland. Even as they built new lives in America, young Joseph grew up living in two worlds, the Italian traditions of his parents and the American dream they crossed, an ocean to chase. Erie was a blue-collar city on the shores of Lake Erie, a place where factories hummed and people earned their living with their hands. The Pistone family wasn't wealthy, but they had something many couldn't buy: stability, love, and a clear sense of right and wrong. Joseph's father worked long hours to provide for his family, and his mother ran a household where respect and discipline were non-negotiable. As a boy, Joseph was observant, careful, and had a quiet intensity that set him apart from other children. He watched people, studied them, understood them in ways that seemed almost natural. He could read a room before he fully entered it, could sense tension or dishonesty the way some people sense changes in the weather. These weren't skills he purposely developed. They were simply part of who he was. He went to local schools where he proved to be a solid but unremarkable student. He wasn't the star athlete or the class president, but he had friends, stayed out of trouble, and showed the kind of steady reliability that teachers appreciated even if they didn't find it particularly memorable. Joseph Pistone was the kind of young man who could blend in anywhere, a quality that would later prove invaluable in ways no one could have imagined. After high school, Pistone pursued higher education, eventually earning a degree. But it was his sense of purpose, his desire to serve something larger than himself, that led him toward law enforcement. In 1969, at the age of 30, Joseph Pistone joined the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was during J. Edgar Hoover's time as director, a time when the FBI was America's top law enforcement agency, though also an organization struggling with its own problems and controversies. By this time, Pistone had married and started a family. His wife was a strong, intelligent woman who shared his values and supported his career choice, even though she understood would mean uncertainty, danger, and long absences. They settled in a modest home in New Jersey, close enough to New York City for his work, but far enough to keep some sense of normalcy. Soon 2 daughters arrived, completing the picture of suburban American life. Joseph Pistone was by all accounts a devoted father and husband. He coached Little League, attended school functions when he could, and tried to be present for his family despite the demands of his job. His daughters adored him, seeing in their father a man of quiet strength and unwavering principles. His wife managed the household with patience and understanding, knowing that the man she'd married had chosen a path that would require sacrifices from them all. In his early years with the FBI, Pistone worked various assignments, learning the craft of investigation, understanding the system of federal law enforcement, and developing the skills that would define his career. He worked bank robbery cases, organized crime investigations, and various other assignments that introduced him to the criminal underworld of the Northeast. But it was in undercover work that Joseph Pistone found his true calling. There was something about taking on another identity, about becoming someone else entirely, that suited his personality and talents. He discovered he had a natural gift for it, not just the acting, but the complete transformation that deep undercover work required. He could adopt mannerisms, speech patterns, and ways of thinking that were entirely different from his own. He could live inside another person's skin without losing himself. His first big undercover operation came early in his FBI career when he successfully got inside a ring of truck thieves operating in the New York area. For months, he lived as a criminal, earning the trust of hardened thieves, participating in their operations while carefully documenting everything for eventual prosecution. The operation resulted in more than 30 arrests and established Pistone's reputation within the Bureau as someone special, someone capable of extraordinary things. His FBI supervisors took notice. Here was an agent who didn't just play a role, he lived it completely. He could maintain his cover under pressure, think on his feet when situations went wrong, and most importantly, he could endure the psychological strain of living two lives at the same time. These qualities were rare, precious, and exactly what the FBI needed for its most ambitious operations against organized crime. During this period, the American Mafia was at the height of its power. The five families of New York Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese controlled vast criminal enterprises involving gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, drug trafficking, and murder for hire. They operated with near impunity, protected by walls of silence, intimidation, and a code of conduct called omerta that made getting inside their organizations nearly impossible. The FBI had tried various approaches to fight the Mafia. They'd used informants, surveillance, wiretaps, and traditional investigative techniques. They'd achieved some successes, arresting low-level soldiers and associates, occasionally catching a captain or underboss. But the bosses, the men who truly ran these criminal empires, remained largely untouchable. They protected themselves behind layers of subordinates, communicated through coded language and go-betweens, and maintained a discipline that kept secrets locked tight. What the FBI needed was someone on the inside, not an informant who could be dismissed as an angry criminal or unreliable witness, but an agent who could work his way up through the ranks, document crimes firsthand, and testify with the credibility of a federal law enforcement officer. They needed someone who could live as a mobster for months or even years, someone who could befriend these criminals, earn their trust, and ultimately bring them to justice. In 1975, FBI officials approached Joseph Pistone with an assignment that would change his life forever. They called it Operation Sunapple, and the initial plan was straightforward: infiltrate a mob-connected truck, hijacking ring operating in New York and New Jersey. The operation was expected to last 6 months, maybe a year at most. Pistone would pose as a skilled thief and fence, someone capable of moving stolen merchandise through criminal networks. The fake identity they created was simple but effective. Donnie Brasco, a small-time jewel thief and expert in precious stones, who operated in Miami and California before coming to New York to expand his opportunities. The backstory was carefully built, drawing on real criminal activities in those cities, creating a paper trail that would hold up under scrutiny. Donnie Brasco had arrest records created by friendly police departments, associates who could vouch for him, undercover agents and informants, and a reputation as someone reliable but not ambitious enough to threaten anyone's position. Joseph Pistone threw himself into preparing for the role. He studied jewelry extensively, learning to identify genuine gemstones from fakes, understanding market values, mastering the language of the trade. He studied mob culture, watching how real criminals dressed, talked, and carried themselves. He practiced Donnie's backstory until it became second nature, until he could recount fictional memories as easily as real ones. The transformation from Joseph Pistone, FBI special agent and family man from New Jersey, to Donnie Brasco, street-smart jewel thief with connections in Miami, required more than just memorizing facts. It required a psychological shift, a willingness to set aside his real identity and embrace a fiction so completely that even he would sometimes forget where Joseph ended and Donnie began. In September 1976. After months of preparation, Joseph Pistone said goodbye to his family one evening, left his suburban home, and drove into New York City. It would be 6 years before he would truly return. Joseph Pistone was about to disappear, and Donnie Brasco was about to be born. The bars and social clubs of Little Italy in Manhattan were worlds unto themselves, territories marked not by signs or boundaries, but by invisible lines everyone understood and no one crossed without permission. These weren't tourist destinations or trendy night spots. They were places where serious men conducted serious business, where fortunes changed hands, where lives could end with a nod and a word. When Donnie Brasco first walked into these smoke-filled rooms in the fall of 1976, he carried himself with the confident ease of someone who belonged, but wasn't trying to prove it. He dressed right, not too flashy, not too shabby. He talked right, not saying too much, showing respect where respect was due. He acted right, buying drinks, telling stories that checked out, demonstrating knowledge about things a jewel thief would know. The initial strategy was simple. Establish Donnie as a legitimate criminal, someone useful but not threatening. He'd hang around, let people come to him, build relationships slowly. The FBI had set up a storefront operation in Little Italy where Donnie could operate, a place he could bring people, conduct business, and be found. They'd equipped him with genuine jewelry and gems that he could use to establish his credentials. Those first months were studies in patience and paranoia. Every conversation was a test. Every question could be a trap. The men he encountered weren't stupid. They'd survived in a world where stupidity got you killed. They watched for inconsistencies, tested stories, checked backgrounds through their networks. One wrong word, one detail that didn't line up, and Donnie would be exposed before the operation truly began. But Pistone was good. Better than good. He inhabited Donnie Brasco so completely that the character took on a life of its own. When someone asked about Miami, Donnie could describe specific bars, neighborhoods, and people with the casual authority of lived experience. When someone brought him a piece of jewelry to evaluate, Donnie's assessment was professional, accurate, and demonstrated expertise. When someone suggested a score, Donnie showed interest but also caution, the way a real criminal would. The target was the Bonanno crime family, one of New York's infamous 5 families. The Bonannos had a long and violent history, having survived internal wars, federal prosecutions, and conflicts with other families. They controlled operations throughout New York and beyond, with connections reaching into legitimate businesses, unions, and political structures. Getting inside the Bonanno family would give the FBI unprecedented access to Mafia operations. But gaining entry wasn't like applying for a job. There were no want ads for aspiring mobsters. You couldn't just show up and ask to join. You had to be introduced by someone already inside, someone willing to vouch for you with their reputation and potentially their life. You had to prove your worth, demonstrate your reliability, and most importantly, show that you could keep your mouth shut. Donnie started small, hanging around the edges, doing minor business with associates and low-level guys. He'd fence some merchandise here, help with a transaction there, always being useful without being pushy. He was patient, playing the long game, understanding that trust in this world wasn't given. It was earned through time and proven loyalty. The psychological toll of this double life began immediately. During the day, Donnie Brasco would conduct business, meet with criminals, and live in a world of constant alertness. But there were also meetings with FBI handlers. Debriefings where Joseph Pistone would resurface long enough to report what he'd learned, hand over recordings if he'd been able to make them, and receive instructions for the next phase of the operation. Then there were the stolen moments with his family, quick visits home when he could manage them, phone calls that had to be brief and vague, birthdays missed, anniversaries forgotten. His wife tried to understand, tried to be supportive, but the strain was there from the beginning. His daughters were young enough that they didn't fully understand why Daddy wasn't around much. But they felt his absence. Every time Pistone left to return to being Donnie, he saw the worry in his wife's eyes. The questions his daughters were starting to ask that the neighborhoods where Donnie operated had their own rhythms and rules. Mulberry Street, with its Italian restaurants and storefronts, could seem charming to tourists who wandered through looking for authentic pasta and cannoli. But beneath the surface, there was another reality. The social clubs with their darkened windows and private back rooms where men gathered to play cards, discuss business, and make decisions that affected lives throughout the city. Donnie learned to read the signs. When a room went quiet as someone entered, that meant respect or fear, and knowing which was crucial. When men spoke in Sicilian rather than English, that meant they didn't want certain ears hearing certain things. When someone was called to a meeting and didn't come back, everyone knew what that meant, and no one asked questions. The FBI's rules of engagement for the operation were clear but complicated. Pistone couldn't commit serious crimes. No violence, no drug deals, no murders, but he had to appear capable of these things, had to maintain credibility as a criminal. The Bureau helped by staging certain situations, creating the appearance that Donnie was involved in activities he actually wasn't. They'd arrest people on warrants and keep it quiet, letting the mob think Donnie had handled a problem. They'd move merchandise that made it seem like Donnie's fencing operations were successful, but there were moral lines that blurred with each passing week. Pistone witnessed crimes he couldn't prevent without blowing his cover. He heard about murders, saw people beaten, watched loan shark victims have their lives destroyed by crushing debt and violent intimidation. The FBI was playing the long game, building cases that would eventually bring down dozens of criminals. But in the meantime, crimes continued, and Donnie had to witness them without flinching. The neighborhoods themselves were changing during this period. Little Italy was shrinking as Chinatown expanded. The old-timers complained about it constantly, seeing it as another sign that their world was disappearing. The younger generation of mobsters was different, too, less traditional, more willing to break the old rules, more interested in drug trafficking despite the Commission's historical restrictions on the narcotics trade. Donnie navigated all of this with careful precision. He was friendly but not familiar, respectful but not servile, competent but not threatening to anyone's position. He was building a reputation as a reliable guy, someone you could do business with, someone who kept his word and his mouth shut. In the Mafia's world, there was everything as 1976 turned into 1977. Donnie's presence in Little Italy became established. He was no longer the new guy. He was a fixture, someone people knew and did business with. The operation that was supposed to last 6 months was extending, expanding, taking on a life beyond anyone's original expectations. The FBI brass were seeing the potential. Donnie had access, he had relationships, and he was documenting criminal activity that could lead to prosecutions. But for Joseph Pistone, the man beneath Donnie Brasco, each day brought him deeper into a world from which escape seemed increasingly distant. He was succeeding beyond all expectations, which meant the operation would continue, which meant more time away from his family, more time living a lie, more time in constant danger. And then in 1978, everything changed. Donnie Brasco met Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, and what was supposed to be a professional infiltration became something far more complex, far more personal, and far more devastating. For everyone involved, the meeting that would define the entire Donnie Brasco operation happened in an ordinary Manhattan social club on an ordinary day in 1978. Benjamin Ruggiero walked through the door, and Donnie Brasco's life and Joseph Pistone's soul would never be the same. Lefty Ruggiero was born on April 19, 1926, which meant he was in his early 50s when he met Donnie, but he looked older. The life had aged him, worn him down in ways that went beyond his years. He had the face of a man who'd seen too much, done too much, and never gotten what he believed he deserved from any of it. His nickname had multiple origins, depending on who told the story. Some said Lefty referred to his preference for left-handed shooting. Others called him Lefty Guns or Lefty Two Guns because he was known for always being armed, usually with 2 weapons, ready for whatever might come. In the Mafia, such nicknames were badges of honor, indicators of a man's reputation and capabilities. Lefty was a soldier in the Bonanno crime family, and he'd been one for his entire adult life. That word soldier meant something specific in Mafia terminology. He wasn't a boss or even a captain. He was a made member, a full member of the family, but one who took orders rather than gave them. In the military metaphor that organized crime borrowed, soldiers did the grunt work, carried out the hits, ran the day-to-day operations that generated income for the family. By all accounts, Lefty was good at his job. He'd been involved in numerous murders. Over the years, estimates ranged from 26 to over 30 hits. Though the exact number was known only to Lefty and God, he'd proven his loyalty time and again, had done stretches in prison without ever cooperating with authorities, had maintained omerta, even when doing so cost him dearly. But despite his dedication, despite his violence, despite his loyalty, Lefty had never advanced up the chain. He'd watched younger men get promoted past him. He'd seen guys he'd mentored become captains while he remained a soldier. It aided him, this lack of recognition, this sense that he'd given everything to the life and gotten little in return. Money was a constant problem for Lefty. Despite decades in organized crime, despite being involved in numerous criminal enterprises, he was perpetually broke. He gambled too much, made poor investments, and somehow never managed to hold on to whatever he earned. His personal life was a mess. Relationships that didn't work out, family problems that never seemed to resolve, and a growing sense that time was passing him by. When Lefty walked into that social club in 1978 and encountered Donnie Brasco, he was looking for opportunity, not the score of a lifetime. Just something to generate income, to prove he still had value, to maybe finally catch the break that had eluded him for so long. The initial connection between them was purely business. Lefty had gotten a diamond from somewhere. The story involved a strip club owner settling a debt, and he needed someone to evaluate it. Someone had mentioned that Donnie Brasco knew jewelry, and Lefty decided to see if this reputation was deserved. Donnie took one look at the stone, and delivered his verdict. It was fake. A good fake, certainly the kind that might fool someone without expertise, but definitely not a genuine diamond out. It was a moment that could have gone badly, telling a mobster that his valuable stone was worthless. But Donnie handled it with exactly the right mix of professionalism and tact. He wasn't smug about it, wasn't trying to embarrass Lefty. He was simply stating a fact that someone in his line of work would know. Lefty's reaction revealed something important about his character. He didn't get angry at Donnie for the bad news. Instead, he got angry at the guy who'd given him the fake diamond. They went together to confront the strip club owner, and when that confrontation confirmed that Donnie was right, something shifted in Lefty's perception. Here was someone who knew what he was talking about. Someone who was straight with him. Someone he could trust to tell him the truth, even when that truth was unwelcome. From that moment, a relationship began to form. Lefty started bringing Donnie around more, introducing him to people, taking him to meetings and card games. In Mafia terminology, Lefty was becoming Donnie's rabbi, his sponsor, mentor, and protector. Having a rabbi was essential for anyone trying to advance in organized crime. Without someone vouching for you, backing you up, and bringing you along, you'd never get anywhere. For the FBI operation, this development was incredibly valuable. Lefty had connections throughout the Bonanno family and beyond. He knew people in all 5 families, had relationships built over decades of criminal activity. Having Lefty as a rabbi meant Donnie would have access to meetings, conversations, and criminal activities that would have taken years to achieve otherwise. But for Joseph Pistone, the man behind Donnie Brasco, this relationship introduced complications that went far beyond operational considerations. Because Lefty Ruggiero, for all his violence and criminality, was a human being, a deeply flawed human being. Certainly, but one with hopes and fears, with vulnerabilities and insecurities, with a capacity for friendship that was genuine, even if it was being built on a foundation of lies. The education that Lefty Ruggiero provided to Donnie Brasco was thorough, detailed, and invaluable both to the FBI operation and to understanding the inner workings of La Cosa Nostra. Lefty took his role as mentor seriously, teaching Donnie not just the rules of the life, but the philosophy behind them. Never rat on your friends, Lefty would say. And it wasn't just a rule, it was the fundamental law upon which everything else was built. Omerta, the code of silence, wasn't simply about not talking to police. It was about loyalty that went beyond all other considerations. Loyalty that was more important than family, safety, even life itself. To break Omerta was to give up any claim to honor, respect, or even humanity. Rats were the lowest form of life, deserving only death, and that death would be neither quick nor merciful. Keep your mouth shut, Lefty continued. This went beyond not cooperating with authorities. It meant not gossiping, not guessing about family business, not discussing things that weren't your concern. The walls have ears, Lefty warned. You never knew who might be listening, who might be working with the feds, who might use your words against you later. A wise man said little and listened much. Don't mess with another man's wife. The rules about women were strict and clear. You could have girlfriends, mistresses, goomas, that was expected, even encouraged. But another maid member's wife was completely off limits. Violating this rule could get you killed. No questions asked, no trial needed. The family approved such revenge, understanding that some boundaries were sacred. Earn and earn for your crew. Being in the Mafia wasn't a job with a salary. It was a business endeavor where everyone was expected to generate income. Some of that income went to you, but a portion always went up the chain to your captain, who then kicked up to the boss. The system was feudal, with money flowing upward and protection flowing downward. If you weren't earning, you weren't valuable. And in the Mafia, people without value had a tendency to disappear. The daily routine that Donnie fell into with Lefty revealed the reality of mob life, which was far less glamorous than movies and television would suggest. They'd meet at social clubs in the morning, grab coffee, and discuss business. Sometimes this meant planning actual criminal activities, fencing stolen goods, loan sharking, gambling operations. Other times it meant simply being available, maintaining presence in their territory, letting people know they could be found if needed. The card games were a constant. They'd play for hours, sometimes with money on the table, sometimes just passing time. These weren't casual, friendly games. They were intense, competitive affairs where reading people and managing money were essential skills. Donnie learned to lose occasionally, to win without gloating, to understand that the cards were often about relationships as much as gambling. Restaurant meetings were another ritual. They'd gather at certain restaurants, where the owners knew them, where specific tables were always available, where conversations could happen without fear of eavesdropping. The food was important. Lefty took his Italian cuisine seriously, but the real business happened between the courses. Deals were made, disputes were resolved, alliances were formed and broken. All over plates of pasta and glasses of wine. Collection runs were part of the weekly routine. Loan shark victims had to pay their vigorish, the interest on borrowed money, and someone had to collect it. Donnie would accompany Lefty on these rounds, watching as small business owners, desperate gamblers, and people buried under crushing debt would hand over cash they couldn't afford to lose. It was ugly work, stripping away any romance about mob life. These weren't victimless crimes. They were people being bled dry, trapped in cycles of debt that could never be fully paid off. The language of the life was its own dialect, a mixture of Italian, Sicilian, and New York slang that took time to master. Forget about it could mean a dozen different things depending on tone and context. Fugazi meant fake or broken. Wise guy was what they called themselves made members, people in the life. Connected meant having relationships with the mob, whether as a member or associate. Pinched meant arrested. Clip meant kill. Learning this vocabulary wasn't just about communication. It was about belonging, showing you understood the culture. The superstitions ran deep. Certain numbers were lucky or unlucky. You never sat with your back to a door. That's how you got shot. You didn't talk about certain things in certain places. Some guys believed in curses, in the malocchio or evil eye, and would perform rituals to ward off bad fortune. These weren't just old world beliefs lingering in modern times. They were taken seriously by men who would otherwise consider themselves rational. The hierarchy was strict and always acknowledged. When a captain entered a room, everyone stood. When a boss spoke, everyone listened. The rank structure wasn't just about respect, it was about survival. Disrespecting someone above, you could have fatal consequences. Even among soldiers, there were subtle levels of status based on earnings, reputation, and relationships. For Donnie Brasco, for Joseph Pistone living as Donnie, the double life intensified with each passing week. He'd spend days and nights with the mob, living as a criminal, participating in their world while carefully avoiding actually committing serious crimes. Then he'd have his meetings with FBI handlers, usually in cars or secure locations, where he'd become Joseph again, long enough to report what he'd learned, hand over evidence, and receive new instructions. The recordings were constant when possible. Pistone wore a wire to as many meetings as he dared, though the technology of the late 1970s was bulky and unreliable. The Nagra recorder he'd use was considered state-of-the-art, but it was still a significant device that had to be hidden under clothing. If someone hugged him wrong, patted him down, or even bumped into him hard enough, they might feel it. The paranoia about being caught with a wire was its own kind of torture. The toll on his marriage and family life was severe and growing worse. His wife tried to be understanding, tried to remember that this was important work, that her husband was serving his country and pursuing justice. But understanding didn't make the empty chair at dinner less empty. It didn't help their daughters understand why Daddy missed their school plays, their birthday parties, their bedtime stories. The FBI paid Pistone's salary, but there was no compensation for the childhood moments he was missing, for the strain appearing in his wife's eyes, for the distance growing between him and the people he loved most. A psychological strain was something the FBI hadn't fully prepared him for, because they'd never had anyone in this deep for this long. Pistone found himself thinking like Donnie, even when he wasn't undercover. The mannerisms, the language, the worldview of a criminal were seeping into his consciousness. Sometimes he'd catch himself and wonder, who am I really? Where does Joseph end and Donnie begin? The question should have had a clear answer, but it was getting harder to find that answer with certainty. Sleep became difficult. When he did sleep, nightmares came not always about getting caught or killed, sometimes about succeeding, about betraying Lefty, about the inevitable day when this all came crashing down and everyone involved paid terrible prices. The moral complexity of what he was doing, befriending someone for the purpose of destroying them, wasn't something Pistone could simply ignore or explain away. As 1978 progressed into 1979, Donnie Brasco's reputation within the Bonanno family grew steadily. Lefty's sponsorship opened doors, but it was Donnie's own performance that kept those doors open and led to new opportunities. He was proving himself valuable, reliable, and profitable, the three qualities that mattered most in organized crime. Through Lefty, Donnie was introduced to higher-ranking members of the family. One of the most significant of these introductions was to Dominic "Sonny" Black Napolitano, a rising captain in the Bonanno organization who was everything Lefty wasn't: ambitious, politically savvy, and positioned for advancement. Sonny Black got his nickname from his dark complexion and jet black hair, but also from his personality. He could be charming one moment and ice cold the next. He was younger than Lefty, more sophisticated in his approach to the life, and better at navigating the political complexities of the Mafia's internal power structures. Where Lefty was a blunt instrument, Sonny was more calculated, more strategic in his thinking. Sonny saw potential in Donnie that went beyond small-time fencing operations. Here was someone with skills, connections in other cities, and the intelligence to operate at higher levels. More importantly, Donnie was generating income for the family. And in the Mafia system, earners got opportunities. Donnie became involved in increasingly sophisticated criminal operations. The fencing of stolen goods expanded beyond jewelry to include electronics, clothing, and other merchandise hijacked from trucks or stolen from warehouses. The profits were significant, and Donnie's cut, which he'd turn over to the FBI, was substantial enough to maintain his credibility as a successful criminal. The FBI found itself in increasingly complicated ethical territory. To maintain Donnie's cover, they had to allow certain crimes to proceed. Stolen merchandise moved through channels that included Donnie's involvement. The FBI would eventually try to recover what they could and arrest the major players. But in the meantime, actual crimes with actual victims were occurring, and their agent was participating in the supply chain. There were illegal gambling operations to witness and document. The Bonanno family ran poker games, craps games, and bookmaking operations that generated enormous revenue. Donnie would attend these events, sometimes as a player, sometimes as security, always observing and mentally recording details for his eventual testimony. The loan sharking operations were particularly ugly watching. Desperate people borrow money at excessive rates, knowing they'd never escape the debt, seeing what happened when people couldn't pay. It all left marks on Pistone's conscience. The violence was usually economic rather than physical, but when borrowers fell too far behind, Physical persuasion became part of the collection process. Then there were the situations where Donnie had to appear capable of murder without actually committing it. This required careful planning with his FBI handlers. When Donnie was told to handle a problem, meaning kill someone, the FBI would intervene. They'd arrest the target on an unrelated warrant, keeping the arrest quiet, letting the mob believe Donnie had handled it permanently. Over the 6-year operation, the FBI staged 4 such murders. Creating paperwork and circumstances, it convinced the Mafia that Donnie Brasco was a killer. This deception was necessary, but psychologically damaging. Pistone had to act like someone capable of murder, had to accept assignments to kill with apparent willingness, had to maintain a reputation as someone dangerous. But he was a law enforcement officer who'd never taken a life, who was fundamentally opposed to murder, who was participating in an elaborate fiction that, if exposed, would mean his immediate and brutal death. The crew Donnie was running with Lefty, Sonny Black, and various other associates operated primarily in Manhattan, but had connections throughout New York and into New Jersey, Florida, and California. The mob's operations weren't localized. They were networks spanning the country and reaching into legitimate businesses, unions, and political structures. Donnie witnessed the corruption firsthand, union officials on the take, politicians who looked the other way, business owners who paid protection money, cops who provided warnings about upcoming raids. The mob wasn't just a criminal organization operating in society's shadows. It was woven into the legitimate economy and political structure in ways that made simple law enforcement approaches inadequate. The internal politics of the Bonanno family were complex and dangerous. There were multiple factions, competing captains, old grudges, and new ambitions, all swirling in a toxic mixture. Sonny Black was positioning himself for advancement, which put him in competition with other captains. Lefty was loyal to Sonny, which meant Donnie, as Lefty's guy, was tied to Sonny's faction by default. In late 1979 and early 1980, these internal tensions were building toward violence. The Bonanno family was fracturing into 3 main factions, each loyal to different bosses or would-be bosses. Philip "Rusty" Rastelli was the official boss, but he was in prison, leaving a power vacuum that others sought to fill. The resulting conflict would be called the Bonanno War, though it was more of a Cold War with occasional hotspots murders, attempted murders, and shifting alliances. Donnie found himself with unprecedented access to these power struggles. He'd attend meetings where captains discussed strategy, where decisions were made about who lived and who died, where the future of the family was being determined. The FBI was getting intelligence that was extraordinary in its detail and implications. They were learning not just about the Bonanno family, but about how all 5 families interacted, how the commission, the Mafia's board of directors, consisting of bosses from all families, operated, how decisions were made at the highest levels. But with access came danger. The deeper Donnie went, the more eyes were on him, the more questions people asked. Some of these questions were casual, natural curiosity about someone rising through the ranks. Others were suspicious, careful probing by made men who'd survived by never fully trusting anyone. There were close calls, moments when the operation nearly ended in disaster. Once, a mobster from another family claimed to know Donnie from California, said they'd done business together years ago. Donnie had never been to California as a criminal, had never met this guy, but hey, continue called show uncertainty or fear. He greeted the man warmly, played along, dropped names from his fictional backstory, and the moment passed. Later, FBI investigation revealed the mobster was confusing Donnie with someone else. But for those terrifying minutes, Pistone thought he'd been exposed. Another time, someone suggested checking Donnie's story by calling contacts in Miami. The FBI had prepared for this, had informants ready to confirm the backstory, but it was still a heart-stopping moment. What if the right person wasn't available? What if someone asked a question the informants couldn't answer? The call was made, the story checked out, but Pistone knew the walls were closing in little by little with each verification attempt. The psychological toll was mounting exponentially. Pistone was having trouble sleeping, even when exhaustion overwhelmed him. When sleep came, nightmares followed, not always about getting caught, but about succeeding, about the inevitable moment when this all ended and people he'd come to know were arrested, imprisoned, or killed because of him. His relationship with Lefty was the most complicated aspect of this psychological burden. Lefty genuinely liked Donnie, trusted him in ways that Lefty didn't trust many people. He'd confide in Donnie about his problems, money troubles, family issues, disappointments about his lack of advancement in the family. He'd talk about his life with a vulnerability that made clear how lonely and frustrated he felt. Lefty was teaching Donnie not just about crime, but about the life's philosophy. "This thing of ours," he'd say, using the phrase that made members used to describe La Cosa Nostra. "It's about loyalty. You're loyal to your friends. They're loyal to you. That's what makes us different from regular people. We take care of our own." The irony was devastating. Lefty was demonstrating loyalty to someone who was betraying him in the most fundamental way possible. Every confidence Lefty shared, every vulnerability he exposed, every moment of genuine friendship, all of it was being documented, recorded, and would eventually be used to send Lefty to prison and possibly to his death. Pistone couldn't simply dismiss Lefty as a monster who deserved whatever was coming. Lefty was a murderer. He'd killed over 24 people, had destroyed families, had inflicted incalculable suffering through his criminal activities. But he was also a human being with a capacity for friendship, someone who'd been shaped by circumstances and choices into what he'd become. The moral complexity of this reality was something Pistone struggled with daily. His wife saw the changes in him during the rare times he made it home. He was distant, distracted, carrying burdens he couldn't share with her because of operational security. She'd ask if he was okay, and he'd say yes, but they both knew it was a lie. The man who left for this assignment wasn't the same man who came home on those brief visits. His daughters were growing up without him. They'd stopped asking when Daddy would be home, because the answer was always soon, and soon never came. The oldest was starting to show resentment, acting out in school, needing her father's presence and guidance. The youngest was simply sad, a persistent sadness that broke Pistone's heart every time he saw it. The FBI tried to provide support. His handlers recognized the strain, the unprecedented nature of what Pistone was enduring, but their primary concern was operational, keeping Donnie's cover intact, gathering evidence, building cases. The psychological well-being of their agent, while not ignored, was secondary to the mission's success. By 1980, the operation had far exceeded its original scope and timeline. What was supposed to be 6 months had stretched to 4 years with no end in sight. The FBI brass in Washington were amazed by what Pistone had accomplished. They had evidence against over 100 mobsters, documentation of over 200 criminal acts, and an unprecedented window into the Mafia's operations. The question was no longer whether to continue the operation, but when and how to end it in a way that maximized prosecutions while ensuring Pistone's survival. The early 1980s brought the Bonanno crime family to a boiling point. Years of simmering tensions, competing ambitions, and disputed leadership finally erupted into open conflict. For Donnie Brasco, positioned in the middle of these events, it meant extraordinary access to witness history and extraordinary danger from all sides. The conflicts, roots traced back to 1979 when the Alde family boss Carmine Galante was murdered in a Brooklyn restaurant. Galante had been trying to consolidate power making moves that threatened other families and even members of his own organization. His assassination, approved by the Commission, left a leadership vacuum that multiple factions sought to fill. Philip Rusty Rostelli was officially recognized as boss by the Commission, but he was in prison, unable to effectively lead. In his absence, various captains positioned themselves as acting leaders or simply pursued their own interests. Dominic "Sonny" Black Napolitano was one of these, captains ambitious and capable, building his own power base. The faction Sonny led included Lefty Ruggiero, and by extension, Donnie Brasco. This meant Donnie had a front-row seat to the strategic planning, the alliance building, and the violent enforcement that characterized this internal struggle. He attended meetings where captains discussed which members were loyal to which faction, where potential threats were identified, where murders were planned. The violence was sporadic but brutal. Made members would be called to meetings and never return. Bodies would turn up in car trunks or vacant lots. Or they wouldn't turn up at all, the men simply disappearing into the kind of grave that mob victims often occupied, unmarked, unknown, and unmourned by anyone outside their immediate families. Donnie witnessed discussions about murders that would happen days or weeks later. He'd hear the planning, understand the motives, know the intended victim. The FBI would be powerless to stop it without exposing their operation. They couldn't warn the targets without revealing they had an agent inside the family. The moral calculation was brutal. Let murders happen to eventually prosecute dozens of mobsters, or intervene to save individual lives, and lose years of investigative work, plus guarantee Pistone's death. The FBI chose to maintain the operation, a decision that haunted everyone involved. Pistone would have to live with the knowledge that he knew about murders beforehand and couldn't prevent them. The Bureau would have to justify this decision, knowing that public opinion might not understand the logic. The targets would die, their families would grieve, and the greater good eventual prosecution of the entire criminal organization would be served at their expense. One such victim was Dominic "Sonny" Red Indelicato, a captain who led a rival faction. In May 1981, Sonny Red and two of his associates were called to what they thought was a peace meeting. It was an ambush. All three were murdered, their bodies later found in a shallow grave. Donnie knew about the plan beforehand, knew these men would die, and could do nothing to stop it without condemning himself and destroying the operation. The psychological impact of this knowledge was crushing. Pistone wasn't a murderer, but he had information that could have saved lives, and he didn't use it. This wasn't a matter of simply witnessing crimes. It was having foreknowledge of murders and making the calculated decision that the broader mission justified not intervening. Whether this calculation was right or wrong would be debated for decades. But for Pistone, living with it in real time, the moral burden was nearly unbearable. Sonny Black's faction was winning the internal war, which meant Donnie's position within the family was strengthening. Sonny appreciated having capable people around him, and Donnie had proven his worth multiple times. The relationship between Sonny and Donnie was different from the one between Lefty and Donnie. Lefty was a mentor and friend. Sonny was more of a boss, someone who valued Donnie's contributions but maintained professional distance. Through Sonny's connections, Donnie met members of other families, the Colombo family, the Gambino family, even members of the Genovese family. All were documented in FBI reports based on Donnie's observations. He was gathering intelligence that crossed family lines, revealing how the commission worked, how inter-family relationships were managed, how disputes were resolved at the highest levels. The social clubs where these meetings happened were studies in controlled paranoia. Everyone knew about FBI surveillance, about wiretaps, about informants. Conversations would happen while music played loudly, or while taking walks outside, or in coded language that assumed someone might be listening. The mobsters weren't stupid. They knew law enforcement was watching, and they took precautions. But they never suspected Donnie. He'd been vouched for by Lefty, was earning for the family, had been tested and proven over years. The fundamental weakness in the Mafia's security wasn't incompetence. It was their reliance on the vouch system. If someone you trusted vouched for someone else, you trusted that person too. It was the glue that held the organization together, and it was also the vulnerability that the FBI exploited perfectly. During this period, Pistone documented criminal activities that would eventually result in charges, ranging from racketeering to murder conspiracy to drug trafficking. The RICO statute Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970, was designed specifically for prosecuting organizations like the Mafia. But RICO required evidence of a pattern of criminal activity by the organization. Donnie was providing exactly that evidence. Detailed documentation of crimes committed as part of the organization's operations. Testimony that would link individual actions to the larger criminal enterprise. The meetings with his FBI handlers became increasingly tense. They'd gather in safe locations, sometimes cars, sometimes hotel rooms, always places where they wouldn't be seen. Pistone would debrief for hours, recounting conversations, identifying people in photographs, explaining the significance of seemingly minor details. The handlers would take notes, ask clarifying questions, and provide instructions for the next phase. But there was also growing concern about Pistone's mental state. He was showing signs of stress that went beyond normal operational strain. His handlers noticed changes in his behavior, his decision-making, his emotional responses. The Bureau brought in psychologists to assess him, and while Pistone was deemed capable of continuing, there were notes in his file about concerns regarding long-term psychological damage. The question of when to end the operation was becoming more urgent. The FBI had enough evidence to prosecute dozens of mobsters. They had documentation of the Bonanno family structure, operations, and criminal activities. They had Pistone's testimony, which would be devastating in court. The question was whether to pull him out now, or let him continue to gather even more evidence. Then came the opportunity that changed everything. Donnie Brasco was going to be made become an official member of the Bonanno crime family. The ceremony to become a made member of La Cosa Nostra was shrouded in secrecy and ritual. For most of the organization's history, law enforcement knew it existed, but had never witnessed it. The FBI had informants who described it, but no agent had ever attended one. And certainly no agent had ever been inducted, as a member got in early 1981. Sonny Black and Lefty Ruggiero both sponsored Donnie Brasco for membership. This was extraordinary for several reasons. First, it meant both men were vouching for Donnie with their lives literally. If Donnie turned out to be a rat or a plant, both sponsors would be killed alongside him. Second, having two sponsors, especially a captain like Sonny and a respected soldier like Lefty, gave Donnie's candidacy significant weight. The requirements for becoming made were specific and non-negotiable. You had to be of Italian descent, at least on your father's side. You had to be sponsored by existing members. You had to have proven your loyalty and capability over years of service. And traditionally, you had to have committed murder, demonstrating your willingness to take a life for the family and creating mutual guilt between you and the organization. Donnie's Italian heritage was legitimate. Pistone was Italian-American, which meant that part checked out under scrutiny. His sponsors were above reproach. His loyalty had been tested and proven over 5 years. And the staged murders that the FBI had orchestrated gave the appearance that Donnie had killed for the family. A ceremony was scheduled for late 1981, just 4 months away, when the decision to pull Donnie out was finally made. If the operation had continued, if the ceremony had proceeded, Joseph Pistone would have become the first FBI agent to be made into the Mafia. The intelligence value would have been unprecedented. He'd have access to the highest levels of the organization, to secrets that only made members knew, to ceremonies and rituals that law enforcement had only heard about, secondhand. But there were insurmountable legal and ethical problems. The ceremony itself involved taking an oath of loyalty to a criminal organization, swearing to place the family above all else, including law and government. For an FBI agent to take such an oath, even as part of an undercover operation, crossed lines that the Bureau's lawyers couldn't justify. There was also the practical concern that the deeper Donnie went, the harder extraction would become. Made members who turned informant were rare rats or hunted relentlessly by the mob. The $500,000 contract that would eventually be placed on Pistone's head would be much higher for a made member who betrayed the organization. Moreover, there were signs that some mobsters were getting suspicious, not enough to act on, but enough to make FBI brass nervous. Questions about Donnie's background were circulating. Some members of other families claimed they couldn't verify parts of his story. The incredible thing was that Donnie had lasted this long without exposure. But the FBI's luck and Pistone's skill might not hold forever. During these final months of the operation, Pistone was living on the edge of psychological breakdown. The strain of maintaining two identities for over 5 years had taken its toll. He was having trouble sleeping, even when exhausted. He'd wake up confused about which identity he was living at that moment. The nightmares were constant and vivid, getting caught, getting killed, seeing Lefty's face when he realized the betrayal. His marriage was hanging by a thread. His wife had endured 5 years of being essentially a single parent. 5 years of worry. 5 years of watching her husband become someone she barely recognized. They'd have conversations where she'd look at him and wonder who this man really was anymore. The daughters had adapted to his absence, which was perhaps more painful than if they'd continued to miss him. They'd found ways to live without their father, and that adjustment might be permanent. The FBI tried to prepare him for life after the operation. There would be a contract on his life that was certain. He'd need to enter witness protection with his family, take new names, relocate to somewhere far from New York. He'd need ongoing psychological counseling to process what he'd experienced. He'd need to testify in numerous trials over many years, repeatedly reliving the operation and facing the men he betrayed. Lefty continued to confide in Donnie during these final months, completely unaware that his friend was about to destroy him. Lefty talked about the future, about how things would be better once Donnie was made, about plans they'd execute together. He talked about his disappointments in life, his regrets, his hopes that maybe things would finally turn around for him. The guilt Pistone felt was overwhelming. He'd gotten to know Lefty as a human being, not just a criminal. He understood that Lefty had been shaped by circumstances and choices, that he'd grown up in neighborhoods where the mob was the power structure, where becoming a wise guy was seen as success. Lefty had committed terrible crimes. He was a murderer many times over, but he was also a person with feelings, fears, and a capacity for genuine friendship. Sonny Black was different, more distant, more purely calculating. Pistone felt less personal guilt about Sonny, though he recognized that Sonny would pay the highest price of anyone. As a captain who'd sponsored Donnie and brought him into intimate family business, Sonny's fate was sealed the moment Donnie's true identity was revealed. The mob would kill him, not just because he'd been fooled, but as an example to others about the cost of such a catastrophic security breach. In July 1981, the FBI made the final decision. The operation would end within weeks. They began planning the extraction with military precision. How do you pull an agent out of the Mafia without getting him killed? How do you time the arrests to maximize prosecutions while minimizing the chance that someone realizes what's happening and orders Donnie's immediate murder? The plan required simultaneous coordination across multiple FBI field offices. Arrest teams would hit targets across New York at the same moment, preventing anyone from warning others. Donnie would be extracted immediately, taken out of New York before anyone knew what was happening. The story would break in newspapers, revealing Donnie Brasco's true identity, but by then, Pistone would be unreachable. On July 26, 1981, Donnie Brasco had his last day as Donnie Brasco. He met with Lefty one final time, had a conversation he'd remember for the rest of his life, said goodbye without being able to say goodbye. Lefty was talking about the future, about opportunities coming their way, about how loyal he was to Donnie. Every word was a knife in Pistone's heart, because he knew what was about to happen, knew that within hours, Lefty's entire world would collapse. That evening, Donnie boarded a plane to Milwaukee. Joseph Pistone was leaving New York for the last time as an undercover agent. Behind him, the FBI was putting into motion the largest coordinated operation against the Mafia in American history. Ahead of him was testimony, trials, witness protection, and a life forever defined by what he'd done. As the plane took off, Pistone looked out the window at New York City's lights disappearing below. Somewhere down there, Lefty Ruggiero was going about his evening, trusting his friend Donnie, having no idea that by morning his entire world would be destroyed. Somewhere down there, Sonny Black Napolitano was planning his future, unaware that he had almost no future left. Somewhere down there, dozens of mobsters were conducting business as usual, not knowing that FBI agents were preparing to arrest them. And in his seat on that plane, Joseph Pistone was between identities, no longer Donnie Brasco, but not yet fully Joseph Pistone again. He was exhausted, traumatized, and terrified of what came next. But he'd done it. He'd accomplished something unprecedented in law enforcement history. The question was, at what cost? The morning of July 27, 1981, began like any other for most members of the Bonanno crime family. They woke up, had their coffee, and prepared for another day of criminal enterprise. What they didn't know was that this would be the day everything changed, the day their world imploded, the day they discovered that one of their own, someone they trusted, worked with, and welcomed into their inner circle was an FBI agent out at precisely 6 a.m. FBI agents across New York City and beyond executed simultaneous raids. They'd been planning this for weeks, coordinating across field offices, ensuring that targets would be hit before anyone could warn anyone else. The timing had to be perfect. If word got out before all the raids were complete, targets might flee, or worse, might realize that Donnie Brasco was the source and order his immediate execution. Lefty, Ruggiero's door was one of those that FBI agents knocked on that morning. He answered in his bathrobe, confused, not understanding what was happening. The agents identified themselves, presented an arrest warrant, and placed him in handcuffs. Lefty's reaction was initially one of confusion and anger. Another arrest, another trip through the system. He'd been arrested before and would likely beat the charges or do a few years at most. This seemed like just another cost of doing business. But then they started reading the charges: racketeering, murder conspiracy, loan sharking, illegal gambling, extortion. The list went on and on, each charge carrying serious time. And then they mentioned the source of the evidence: Joseph D. Pistone, FBI special agent, who had been operating undercover as Donnie Brasco for over 5 years. Lefty's reaction, as described by the agents present, was one of complete disbelief followed by devastation. No, he kept saying, no, not Donnie. Not him. You're lying. But the agents showed him photographs Donnie with various mobsters, pictures that the FBI had taken during the operation. They showed him Donnie's real FBI credentials, his actual background. The evidence was undeniable. The realization hit Lefty like a physical blow. His friend, his protege, the guy he'd vouched for with his life, was a Fed. Every conversation they'd had, every confidence Lefty had shared, every criminal activity he'd involved Donnie in, all of it had been documented, recorded, and would now be used against him in court. But worse than the legal implications was the personal betrayal. Lefty had genuinely liked Donnie, had trusted him in ways he trusted few people, had been planning a future with him as a made member. According to agents who witnessed Lefty's arrest, he became physically ill, vomiting from the shock and betrayal. His hands shook. He kept repeating, "How? How did I not know?" It was a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Across the city, similar scenes were playing out. Mobsters were being arrested in their homes, in social clubs, at their legitimate business fronts. Each one was informed that the evidence against them came from an undercover FBI agent named Joseph Pistone, who'd been posing as Donnie Brasco. Each one experienced shock, disbelief, and eventually the crushing realization that they'd been infiltrated more completely than anyone had thought possible. Sonny Black Napolitano wasn't among those arrested initially. He got word about what was happening and went into hiding, knowing that his fate was sealed. As a captain who'd sponsored Donnie and given him access to the family's highest levels of operation, Sonny had committed the most unforgivable sin in the Mafia. He'd let a rat in. The mob's justice would be swift and brutal, and Sonny knew it. By noon, news was breaking in newspapers and on television. The headlines were sensational. FBI agent infiltrates Mafia for 6 years. Undercover agent brings down Bonanno crime family. Greatest undercover operation in FBI history. Reporters scrambled to piece together the story, interviewing FBI officials, law enforcement experts, and anyone who could provide details about this unprecedented operation. The photographs published in newspapers showed Donnie Brasco Joseph Pistone standing with various mobsters at social clubs, restaurants, and other locations. These were surveillance photos that the FBI had been taking throughout the operation, documenting Pistone's infiltration. For the mobsters who saw these photos, it was confirmation of their worst nightmare. The enemy hadn't just been at the gates, he'd been inside, sitting at their tables, listening to their secrets. The reaction throughout New York's organized crime world was seismic. If the Bonanno family could be infiltrated this completely, what about the other families? Who else might be a plant? The paranoia was immediate and intense. Made members looked at associates with new suspicion. Long-time relationships were questioned. The fundamental trust that held the organization together was shattered. For the commission, the board of bosses from all 5 families, this was a catastrophe that demanded response. The Bonanno family had allowed the most damaging security breach in Mafia history. Their sloppiness, their failure to properly check someone who'd gotten as far as Donnie had, reflected poorly on La Cosa Nostra as a whole. There would be consequences, and those consequences would be severe. Joseph Pistone, meanwhile, was in Milwaukee under heavy FBI protection. He'd been moved immediately after landing, taken to a safe house, kept isolated while the arrests went down. The FBI was taking no chances. The contract on his life was certain to be substantial, and the mob's reach was long. Even in Milwaukee, even under protection, Pistone wasn't entirely safe. His family was being relocated as well. His wife and daughters were taken from their New Jersey home, given new identities, moved to a location that even Pistone didn't initially know. The FBI's witness protection program was good, but it wasn't perfect. And the agency knew that the mob would spare no expense in trying to find and kill the agent who'd done so much damage. The psychological impact on Pistone was complex. There was relief that the operation was over, that he no longer had to maintain the exhausting double life. But there was also loss. He'd been Donnie Brasco for over 5 years longer than he'd been an FBI agent before the operation began. Donnie had become a part of him, And now Donnie was gone dead, revealed as a fiction. Who was Joseph Pistone now? After living as someone else for so long, how do you come back to your original identity? And there was the guilt overwhelming, crushing guilt about Lefty. Pistone had known this moment would come, had prepared for it as best he could, but actually experiencing it was worse than he'd imagined. Lefty's friendship had been genuine, even if it was based on a lie. The betrayal was real and devastating, and Pistone had to live with the knowledge that he'd destroyed a man who trusted him completely. While law enforcement celebrated the operation's success, the Mafia's response was unfolding according to its own brutal logic. The rules were clear. If you vouched for someone who turned out to be a rat, you died with the rat. Lefty Ruggiero had vouched for Donnie Brasco with his life, and now that life was forfeit. But Lefty was in FBI custody, which actually saved his life, at least temporarily. The mob couldn't kill him in prison, not easily, anyway. The FBI's decision to arrest Lefty immediately wasn't just about prosecution. It was also about keeping him alive long enough to face justice in a courtroom rather than in a mob execution. Sonny Black Napolitano had no such protection. He'd gone into hiding after the arrests, knowing what was coming, but perhaps hoping he might find some way to escape his fate. On August 17, 1981, less than a month after the operation ended, Sonny received a call. He was summoned to a meeting with other captains. He knew what this meant, but refusing to go would make things worse for his family. In the Mafia's code, you faced your punishment with dignity, even when that punishment was death. Sonny drove to the meeting location in Brooklyn. He was never seen alive again. His body was eventually discovered, hands cut off as a message about the cost of bringing a rat into the family. The mutilation was both symbolic and practical. It made identification more difficult, and it served as a warning to others about what happened when security was compromised. The murder of Dominic Napolitano sent shock waves through the Bonanno family. Sonny had been a rising star, a capable captain with a bright future. But in the Mafia's math, his success meant nothing compared to his catastrophic failure in judgment. He'd vouched for an FBI agent, had given that agent access to the family's inner workings, and such a failure could only be answered with death. The Commission's response to the Bonanno family as a whole was almost as severe. At a meeting of the bosses from all 5 families, a decision was made that was unprecedented. The Bonanno family would be removed from the Commission. They'd still exist as a crime family, but they'd lose their seat at the table where the most important decisions were made. It was a humiliation, and a practical penalty that weakened the Bonannos. Significantly, the contract on Joseph Pistone's life was set at $500,000, enormous sum that demonstrated how seriously the mob took his betrayal. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about sending a message. Anyone who infiltrated the Mafia, anyone who broke omerta, anyone who betrayed the family would be hunted forever. The mob had long memories and deep pockets, and they wanted everyone, both inside and outside the organization, to know that such betrayals carried a permanent death sentence. The contract specified that Pistone should be killed on sight. Anyone who accomplished this would receive not just the monetary reward, but also immense respect within the organization. Hitmen across the country were looking for Joseph Pistone, studying his photograph, waiting for any information about his location. The FBI took the threat seriously. Pistone was moved multiple times, kept under heavy protection, given a new identity through the Witness Protection Program. His family was relocated separately, given their own new identities. The precautions were extensive, but everyone involved knew that the mob had resources, patience, and determination. The threat wouldn't disappear, would persist for the rest of Pistone's life. Within the Bonanno family, the paranoia and suspicion were toxic. If Donnie Brasco could fool them for 6 years, who else might be a plant? Associates were questioned aggressively. Backgrounds were investigated and reinvestigated. Long-time relationships came under scrutiny. The trust that had held the organization together was gone, replaced by constant suspicion. Some mobsters became informants themselves after the operation ended. If the FBI could place an agent that deep inside the family, maybe cooperating with the feds was the smart play. The RICO statute meant that even relatively minor members were facing decades in prison. The prospect of growing old behind bars, combined with the paranoia within the family, led some members to cut deals with prosecutors. This cascade of cooperating witnesses further damaged the Bonanno family and organized crime more broadly. Each informant provided additional evidence, supported Pistone's testimony, and implicated more members. The walls were closing in on the American Mafia from multiple directions, simultaneously. The other four families weren't immune to the fallout. Pistone had documented interactions with members of all five families, had evidence of commission meetings, had witnessed coordination between families on various criminal enterprises. Federal prosecutors had enough evidence to pursue RICO cases against mobsters throughout New York's organized crime structure. For the Mafia, the Donnie Brasco operation represented a threat to their existence. Their business model depended on trust, on loyalty, on the certainty that omerta would be maintained. But how could you maintain that certainty when an FBI agent had successfully posed as a mobster for 6 years? How could you trust anyone when the most trusted members had been fooled so completely? The operation's success inspired law enforcement agencies nationwide. If the FBI could infiltrate the Bonanno family, maybe other agencies could infiltrate other organizations. Undercover operations became more ambitious, better funded, and more carefully planned. The Donnie Brasco operation became a case study taught at law enforcement academies, analyzed for its techniques and successes. But for the people directly involved, Pistone, his family, the mobsters he'd befriended and betrayed, the success was measured in different terms. Lives had been destroyed, relationships shattered, trust permanently broken. The legal victories were real and significant, but they came with costs that numbers couldn't capture. The prosecutions resulting from the Donnie Brasco operation would span years and dozens of trials. Joseph Pistone's testimony would be required repeatedly, forcing him to relive the operation again and again, facing the men he befriended while documenting their crimes. The first major trial began in 1982. The defendants included several high-ranking members of the Bonanno family, charged under RICO with running a criminal enterprise. The prosecution's case was built primarily on Pistone's testimony and the recordings he'd made during the operation. Walking into that courtroom for the first time was surreal for Pistone. He was no longer Donnie Brasco. He was Special Agent Joseph D. Pistone, dressed in a suit, clean-cut, looking every inch the federal law enforcement officer he'd been before the operation began. But sitting at the defense table were men who'd known him as Donnie, who'd drunk with him, eaten with him, done business with him. Their faces showed a mixture of emotions: hatred, certainly. Pistone had betrayed them in the most fundamental way possible, but also confusion, even hurt. Some of these men had genuinely liked Donnie Brasco, had considered him a friend. Reconciling the person they'd known with the FBI agent sitting on the witness stand was psychologically jarring. Lefty Ruggiero was among the defendants. He sat at the defense table, staring at Pistone with an expression that combined devastation and rage. When their eyes met, Pistone saw the depth of the betrayal reflected back at him. Lefty had vouched for Donnie with his life, had trusted him completely, and that trust had been weaponized against him. The prosecution, led by assistant U.S. attorneys who'd been preparing for these trials since the operation ended, methodically walked Pistone through his testimony. What was his true identity? How did the operation begin? How did he meet the defendants? What crimes did he witness them commit? Pistone's testimony was detailed, professional, and damning. He recounted specific conversations, described criminal activities, placed defendants at particular locations at particular times. He authenticated recordings that had been made during the operation, explaining the context of conversations that jurors heard, played back in the courtroom. The defense attorney's strategy was to attack Pistone's credibility. They portrayed him as a liar, someone who'd lied every day for 6 years, someone whose entire relationship with these men had been based on deception. How could the jury trust someone who was a professional deceiver? How could they believe his testimony when he'd proven himself capable of such elaborate, sustained dishonesty? But this strategy had limited effectiveness. Yes, Pistone had lied to the mobsters. That was the entire point of an undercover operation. But he was now testifying under oath as an FBI agent, and there was no evidence that he was lying now. The recordings supported his testimony. Documents backed up his accounts. Other evidence aligned with what he described. The defense also tried to portray Pistone as an entrapment agent, someone who'd encourage crimes that wouldn't have happened without his involvement. But the evidence showed otherwise. These men had been committing crimes long before Donnie Brasco appeared, and they'd continue committing crimes regardless of who was around to witness them. Cross-examination was intense. Defense attorneys attacked every aspect of Pistone's testimony, looking for inconsistencies, contradictions, anything that might undermine his credibility. They pressed him about his relationship with Lefty, trying to get him to admit that he'd manipulated a trusting man, that he'd exploited friendship for professional gain. These questions cut deep because they contained truth. Pistone had exploited Lefty's friendship, had used his trust as a weapon. On the witness stand, under oath, he had to acknowledge this reality while also maintaining that it was necessary, that it was justified by the greater good of bringing down a criminal organization. The moral complexity of his position was laid bare in that courtroom. During breaks in testimony, Pistone couldn't make eye contact with Lefty or the other defendants. The weight of what he'd done, the necessity of it, but also the human cost was crushing. He'd done his job brilliantly, had gathered evidence that would result in dozens of convictions. But sitting in that courtroom, facing men who'd once called him friend, the victory felt hollow. The trials would continue for years, different defendants, different charges, but always Pistone's testimony at the center. He testified in New York, in other states, in proceedings that seemed endless. Each time, he had to recount the operation, defend his methods, face contenue men he betrayed. The convictions rolled in steadily. Lefty Ruggiero was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Other defendants received similar or longer sentences. The evidence was too strong, the testimony too detailed, the recordings too clear. The defense attorneys fought hard, but they were working against overwhelming evidence. By the mid-1980s, over 100 mobsters had been charged based on evidence from the Donnie Brasco operation. The convictions totaled over 100 years of collective prison sentences. The Bonanno crime family was devastated, its leadership decimated, its operations disrupted. The other 4 families were also damaged, facing prosecutions based on evidence Pistone had gathered about inter-family cooperation. The success of the prosecutions validated the operation's approach. The FBI had proven that deep, long-term undercover infiltration could work against organized crime. The RICO statute, combined with patient intelligence gathering and credible witness testimony, could bring down entire criminal organizations. This became the model for future operations against the Mafia and other organized crime groups. But the human cost was never far from Pistone's mind. During testimony, when he described his friendship with Lefty, he'd sometimes have to pause, gathering himself before continuing. The FBI agents and prosecutors who worked with him saw the toll it was taking. This wasn't a man celebrating his triumphs. This was a man processing profound trauma while being forced to. Publicly recount it, repeatedly doubt the witness protection program that Joseph Pistone and his family entered was designed to keep them safe from the mob's vengeance. New names, new location, new identities, everything that connected them to their former lives was erased, at least officially. But the program couldn't erase memories, couldn't heal psychological wounds, couldn't restore what had been lost during those 6 years. The family was relocated to a location that remains undisclosed to this day. Pistone's wife and daughters had to leave behind everything familiar: their home, their friends, their extended family, their community. The daughters had to leave schools where they'd built friendships, had to start over in a new place where they couldn't explain where they'd come from or why they'd moved. The rules of witness protection were strict. No contact with old friends or family members unless those relationships were approved and monitored. No social media presence, no public profiles, nothing that might help someone locate them. They were ghosts, living anonymous lives far from everything they'd known. For Pistone's wife, the adjustment was particularly difficult. She'd already sacrificed 6 years of normal married life while her husband was undercover. Now she was being asked to sacrifice everything else: her identity, her home, her connections to the world. The resentment, though she tried to suppress it, was there. She'd supported her husband's career and believed in the importance of his work, but the cost had been enormous. The daughters struggled with their new identities. Teenagers and young adults have a hard enough time figuring out who they are without having to literally assume new identities. They couldn't tell new friends the truth about their background. They had to maintain lies in every relationship, just as their father had done during his operation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the family. Pistone himself was dealing with psychological issues that the FBI's counseling could only partially address. He'd spent 6 years being Donnie Brasco, had lived so deeply in that identity that parts of it had become inseparable from his core self. Now he was supposed to be Joseph Pistone again, but that person didn't exist anymore, not in the way he had before. 1976 identity confusion plagued him. He'd catch himself using Donnie's mannerisms, Donnie's speech patterns, Donnie's ways of thinking about situations. Sometimes he'd forget which identity he was supposed to be inhabiting at any given moment. The psychological term for this is role confusion, but that clinical language didn't capture the existential dizziness of not knowing who you really are. The nightmares continued, often more intense than they'd been during the operation. He'd dream about being discovered, about Lefty's face when learning the truth, about Sonny Black's murder. He'd dream about his daughters, growing up without really knowing him, about his wife looking at him with the eyes of a stranger. He'd wake up disoriented, sometimes calling out, his wife having to calm him back to reality. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't something the FBI had adequately prepared for, because they'd never had an agent in this deep for this long. Pistone was essentially a test case for what happens to human psychology when you live a double life for years. The results weren't encouraging. Even with therapy, even with his family around him, even with the operation successfully concluded, he was struggling. His relationship with his wife was strained to the breaking point. They'd been through so much together. The 6 years of his absence, the trauma of relocation, the ongoing threat to their lives. Some relationships grow stronger through shared hardship. Others break under its weight. The Pistone marriage survived, but it was scarred, marked permanently by what they'd endured. The FBI provided financial support and security monitoring, but they couldn't provide what the family really needed: normalcy, safety without paranoia, the ability to live openly. The $500,000 contract on Pistone's head was still active. The mob had long memories and deep pockets. Constant alertness was required every day, every moment. That kind of constant awareness is psychologically exhausting, and it never truly ends. Meanwhile, Lefty Ruggiero was serving his 15-year sentence in federal prison. According to accounts from other inmates and guards, Lefty never recovered from the betrayal. He'd been a tough guy his whole life, had done prison time before without breaking, but this was different. The betrayal by Donnie, by Joseph Pistone, had broken something fundamental in Lefty's mind. He'd talk about Donnie to anyone who'd listen, trying to understand how he'd missed the signs, how he'd been fooled so completely. He'd alternate between rage and sadness, between wanting to kill Pistone and wanting to understand why his friend had betrayed him. The other inmates mostly ignored him. Nobody wanted to hear about how he'd been fooled by a Fed dot in prison. Lefty's health got worse. He'd been a heavy smoker his entire life, and lung cancer was the inevitable result. The disease progressed quickly, and by the early 1990s, he was dying. The Bonanno family, what was left of it, largely ignored him. He'd vouched for a rat. As far as they were concerned, he might as well have been a rat himself. Lefty Ruggiero died on November 24, 1994, in a prison hospital. He was 68 years old. According to people who were with him near the end, he never forgave Donnie Brasco. He never understood how he'd been so completely deceived by someone he trusted with his life. His last years were marked by bitterness, betrayal, and the knowledge that his life in the Mafia, everything he'd sacrificed for, everything he believed in, had been destroyed by the man he thought was his friend. When Pistone learned of Lefty's death, his reaction was complex. There was no joy, no sense of satisfaction that an enemy had died. Lefty had been a murderer, a criminal who'd inflicted enormous suffering over his lifetime. But he'd also been a human being, someone Pistone had known intimately, someone who'd shown kindness and friendship, even if it was all based on a lie. Pistone attended a memorial service, not for Lefty specifically, but a general service he held privately to mourn all the casualties of the operation. Sonny Black, who'd been murdered. Lefty, who died in prison, broken and betrayed. The other mobsters who'd been killed during the Bonanno family war. Even in some way, Donnie Brasco himself, the identity that had died when the operation ended. The therapy Pistone underwent explored these complicated feelings. His therapist helped him understand that he could acknowledge Lefty's humanity, while still recognizing that the operation had been necessary. Good people sometimes have to do hard things in service of justice. The fact that those hard things come with psychological and emotional costs doesn't make them wrong. It makes them tragic. But necessary tragedies exist in a complicated moral universe. In 1986, Joseph Pistone officially retired from the FBI. He'd served with distinction, had accomplished something unprecedented in law enforcement history, and had paid a price that few could understand. The Bureau awarded him multiple commendations, recognized his sacrifice, and provided ongoing support for his security needs. But retirement didn't mean disappearing. In 1988, Pistone published Donnie Brasco, My Undercover Life in the Mafia, written with author Richard Woodley. The book was a detailed account of the operation, revealing for the first time the full scope of what he'd experienced. It became a bestseller, fascinating readers with its insider perspective on the Mafia and the psychological complexity of deep undercover work. Writing the book was therapeutic in some ways, allowing Pistone to process and organize his experiences into a coherent narrative. But it was also painful, forcing him to relive every moment, every betrayal, every moral compromise. The chapters about Lefty were particularly difficult to write, because they required honest examination of a relationship that was simultaneously genuine and completely false. The book's success brought Pistone into the public eye in ways that complicated his security situation. Now his face was on television. His story was being discussed nationally, and the mob knew exactly what he looked like. The FBI increased his security precautions, but everyone understood that publicity came with risks. In 1997, Hollywood adapted the story into a major motion picture titled Donnie Brasco. Johnny Depp played the role of Joseph Pistone, Donnie Brasco, while Al Pacino portrayed Lefty Ruggiero. The casting was inspired. Depp brought the right combination of charm and moral ambiguity to the role, while Pacino captured Lefty's world-weariness and desperate need for respect. Pistone served as a consultant on the film, helping the actors understand the characters, teaching them mannerisms and speech patterns, ensuring authenticity in how the mob life was portrayed. Working on the film was surreal, watching Johnny Depp embody Donnie Brasco. Watching Al Pacino portray a man Pistone had known intimately, seeing his life transformed into entertainment. The movie took some dramatic liberties, as Hollywood always does. Certain events were compressed or altered for narrative purposes. Some characters were composites. The ending was modified to create closure that real life hadn't provided. But the emotional truth of the story remained intact. The movie captured the psychological toll of the operation, the complexity of the Donnie-Lefty relationship, and the moral ambiguity inherent in deep undercover work. Al Pacino's portrayal of Lefty Ruggiero was particularly powerful. He captured the character's desperation, his longing for respect and recognition, his fundamental decency despite his criminal activities. The movie's most heartbreaking scene shows Lefty realizing he's been betrayed, understanding that his friend was an FBI agent all along. Pacino played it with devastation rather than rage, showing a man whose world has just collapsed completely. The film was both a critical and commercial success, earning strong reviews and introducing the Donnie Brasco story to a worldwide audience. For people who'd never heard of the operation, the movie was a revelation about FBI capabilities and the human cost of undercover work. For people in law enforcement, it was validation of the sacrifices agents make. But for Joseph Pistone, watching the movie was an emotionally complicated experience. On one hand, it was gratifying to see his story recognized, to have the operation's importance acknowledged by its transformation into a major Hollywood production. On the other hand, seeing his life, his trauma, his betrayals, his moral compromises turned into entertainment was disconcerting. The movie reignited public interest in the case, leading to renewed media attention, new interview requests, and additional scrutiny of Pistone's life. He did some interviews, always careful about what he revealed, always conscious that the mob's contract on his life was still active. He spoke about the operation's importance, about organized crime's threat to American society, about the dedication of law enforcement officers who make extraordinary sacrifices. In 2004, Pistone published another book, The Way of the Wise Guy, which provided additional insights into Mafia culture and his experiences infiltrating it. This book was less story-driven than his first, focusing instead on explaining how the mob operated, what their codes and customs meant, how they thought about loyalty and betrayal. Through his writing and public speaking, Pistone became an expert voice on organized crime. Law enforcement agencies invited him to speak at conferences and training sessions. His techniques for deep undercover work became standard curriculum at the FBI Academy. The operation he'd conducted alone was now informing operations worldwide, not the impact of the Donnie Brasco operation on American organized crime cannot be overstated. Before Pistone, the Mafia had seemed nearly invincible, protected by omerta and the vouch system that made infiltration nearly impossible. After Pistone, the Mafia was permanently weakened, never recovering to its pre-1981 power levels. The most immediate impact was on the Bonanno crime family specifically. The arrests, convictions, and internal killings that followed the operation's exposure devastated the family structure. Their removal from the commission was humiliating and practical. They lost influence over major decisions affecting organized crime in New York. It took years for them to rebuild. And even then, they never regained their former status. But the damage extended far beyond the Bonannos. The other four families, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese, all faced prosecutions based on evidence Pistone had gathered. The commission's meetings that he'd witnessed or heard about provided prosecutors with unprecedented insight into how the families coordinated their activities. RICO cases built on this evidence resulted in convictions throughout New York's Mafia structure. The psychological impact was equally significant. The paranoia that followed the operation's exposure never fully went away. Made members looked at associates with new suspicion. The vouch system, which had been the bedrock of Mafia security, was revealed as vulnerable. If Lefty Ruggiero, a career mobster with decades of experience, could be fooled for 6 years, anyone could be fooled. This uncertainty ate away at the trust that organized crime required to function effectively. Recruitment became more difficult. Young men in Italian-American neighborhoods, who might once have viewed the Mafia as a path to respect and wealth, now saw it as dangerous and compromised. The FBI could plant agents anywhere, could record anything, could build cases that resulted in life sentences under RICO, the risk-reward calculation that had once favored organized crime now looked much less favorable. The success of the Donnie Brasco operation inspired similar approaches against other criminal organizations. The FBI and other law enforcement agencies began pursuing more ambitious, longer-term undercover operations against drug cartels, motorcycle gangs, white-collar criminals, and eventually terrorists. The techniques Pistone pioneered, deep cover, long-term identity assumption, careful evidence gathering, became standard approaches in serious criminal investigations. Law enforcement training was revolutionized by lessons learned from the operation. The FBI developed better protocols for supporting undercover agents, recognizing the psychological toll such operations take. They improved exit strategies, understanding that extraction had to be carefully planned to maximize prosecutions while protecting the agent. They established better oversight, mechanisms to ensure undercover agents didn't cross legal or ethical lines while maintaining their covers. The psychological support for undercover agents improved dramatically. The Bureau recognized that what Pistone had endured 6 years living a double life, the identity confusion, the moral compromises required professional mental health intervention. They developed screening procedures to identify agents capable of handling deep cover work and support, systems to help them process the experience. Afterward, the legal framework for undercover operations was also refined. The Donnie Brasco operation had raised questions about how far agents could go in participating in criminal activities. Could they commit crimes to maintain their cover? Where was the line between necessary deception and entrapment? These questions were debated in legal circles and eventually addressed through guidelines that tried to balance operational effectiveness with constitutional constraints. Academically, the operation became a case study in numerous fields. Criminologists studied it to understand organized crime structures. Psychologists examined it to understand identity, deception, and trauma. Ethicists debated the moral implications of befriending someone for the purpose of destroying them. Law professors analyzed it to explore the boundaries of acceptable law enforcement tactics. For the general public, the Donnie Brasco story, especially as popularized by the movie, changed perceptions about both the FBI and the Mafia. The FBI was shown to be capable of extraordinary dedication and sophistication in its approach to organized crime. The Mafia was revealed not as the all-powerful organization of popular imagination, but as a group of flawed human beings making terrible choices, vulnerable to infiltration and prosecution. The story also humanized both sides in ways that complicated, simple good versus evil narratives. Joseph Pistone wasn't a superhero. He was a man who made enormous sacrifices and paid psychological prices that would last his lifetime. The mobsters weren't cartoon villains. They were people with families, feelings, and capacities for friendship. Even if those qualities coexisted with violence and criminality. In interviews conducted years after the operation, Joseph Pistone has been remarkably candid about the costs of what he accomplished. When asked if it was worth it, if the successful prosecutions and damage to organized crime justified the personal toll, his answer has been consistently nuanced. Yes, it was necessary. Yes, it achieved important results. But the price was higher than anyone anticipated, and some costs can never be fully paid or reconciled. The damage to his family relationships, while not complete, was substantial and permanent. His daughters grew up without their father, present during critical years. They learned to function in his absence, developed coping mechanisms that assumed he wouldn't be there. When he finally returned to their lives full-time after the operation ended, the adjustment was difficult for everyone. The father they remembered from early childhood wasn't the same man who came back. He was quieter, more haunted, carrying burdens he couldn't fully explain, even to people he loved. His marriage survived, which was something many families shattered by similar experiences never recover. But survival isn't the same as thriving. His wife had spent 6 years essentially as a single parent. 6 years worrying about whether her husband would come home alive. 6 years growing accustomed to managing life without him. When he returned, they had to renegotiate their entire relationship, figure out how to be married again after so long apart. The fact that they succeeded speaks to their resilience and commitment, but the scars remained. The psychological impact on Pistone himself has been a lifelong challenge. The identity confusion that plagued him immediately after the operation's end never fully resolved. Decades later, he'd still sometimes catch himself thinking like Donnie rather than Joseph. Still sometimes feel the habits and mannerisms of his undercover persona emerging unexpectedly. The therapeutic term for this is identity. Integration, learning to accept that Donnie was part of who he is, rather than trying to separate the identities completely. Nightmares decreased in frequency over the years, but never entirely stopped. Certain triggers, seeing a picture from the operation, hearing a particular song that was popular during those years, visiting New York, could bring back the anxiety and fear. PTSD doesn't have a cure. It has management, coping strategies, ways to live with it. Pistone developed those strategies over time, but he's been honest about the fact that he'll never be entirely free of the operation's psychological shadow. The guilt about Lefty Ruggiero has been perhaps the most persistent emotional burden. In interviews, Pistone has been clear that Lefty was a murderer who'd committed terrible crimes and deserved prosecution. But he's also acknowledged that their friendship, while built on a lie, had genuine elements. Lefty had shown him kindness, had trusted him completely, had been excited about their future together in the family. Betraying that trust, even in service of justice, left marks that time hasn't erased. Pistone has said that he sometimes imagines conversations with Lefty, imagines what he'd say if he could explain why he did what he did. Would Lefty understand that it was never personal, that Pistone was just doing his job? Probably not. The Mafia's worldview didn't allow for such explanations. To them, what Pistone did was the ultimate betrayal, regardless of his motivations. But Pistone wishes he could explain anyway. Wishes Lefty could have understood that the respect and affection, while not based on truth about identity, weren't entirely false in their emotional content. The question of whether the operation could or should have been conducted differently is one that law enforcement professionals have debated extensively. Could it have been shorter? Possibly, though a shorter operation would have yielded less evidence and fewer prosecutions. Could Pistone have maintained more emotional distance from his targets? Perhaps, though that distance might have made him seem suspicious and prevented the access he achieved. Could the FBI have done more to support him psychologically during the operation? Certainly, though they didn't fully understand the toll it was taking until it was over. The consensus among law enforcement professionals is that the operation, for all its difficulties, was conducted as well as could be reasonably expected. Pistone made extraordinarily difficult choices in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. He crossed no legal lines, committed no crimes that would invalidate the evidence he gathered, and maintained his cover longer than anyone thought possible. The fact that doing so came with psychological costs doesn't mean Pistone or the FBI did anything wrong. It means that justice sometimes requires sacrifices that leave permanent marks on the people who make them. The broader question of whether such operations are ethically justifiable continues to be debated. Some ethicists argue that befriending someone for the purpose of betraying them crosses moral lines that shouldn't be crossed, even in pursuit of justice. Others counter that organized crime represents such a threat to society that extraordinary measures are justified. Still others suggest that the ethical question isn't whether such operations should happen, but how they should be conducted to minimize harm while maximizing effectiveness. Pistone himself has generally avoided these philosophical debates, preferring to focus on the practical realities of law enforcement work. In his view, the Mafia was a criminal organization inflicting real harm on real people. Stopping them required infiltration because traditional investigative methods had proven insufficient. He volunteered for the assignment, knowing it would be difficult, accepted the risks and costs, and accomplished something unprecedented. Whether that makes him a hero, a tragic figure, or something more complicated is for others to decide. As of the present day, Joseph Pistone remains in witness protection, though the specifics of his location and current identity are closely guarded secrets. The $500,000 contract on his life has never been canceled. While the Bonanno family is much weaker than it was in 1981, and while many of the men who knew Donnie Brasco are dead or imprisoned, the contract persists as a matter of principle. The Mafia's credibility depends on following through on its threats. Even decades later, Pistone is now in his mid-80s, having lived far longer than many people involved in the operation expected. His survival is a testament both to the FBI's witness protection program and to his own constant awareness. Even now, decades after the operation ended, he maintains security protocols, varies his routines, and remains aware of his surroundings in ways that most people never have to consider. He continues to work as a consultant and expert on organized crime, though always under careful security arrangements. He speaks at law enforcement conferences, provides analysis for documentaries and news programs, and occasionally writes articles about the Mafia's evolution. His expertise is unique. He experienced the organization from inside in ways that few people ever have, and his insights continue to be valuable for understanding organized crime. His relationship with his family has stabilized over the years, though it required decades of work, therapy, and patient rebuilding. His daughters are adults now with their own families, having grown up with the strange burden of knowing their father accomplished something extraordinary while also experiencing his absence during critical years of their childhood. They're proud of what he did, but they also understand the costs it extracted from everyone involved. His wife remains with him, having endured more than most spouses could imagine enduring. Their marriage survived multiple relocations, constant security threats, the psychological aftermath of the operation, and the challenge of rebuilding a relationship after years of separation. That survival represents its own kind of victory, perhaps as significant in its way as the legal victories the operation achieved. The Bonanno crime family still exists, though in significantly weakened form. The Donnie Brasco operation, combined with subsequent prosecutions and the general decline of traditional organized crime, reduced them to a shadow of their former power. They're still involved in various criminal enterprises, gambling, loan sharking, some union infiltration, but they're no longer the formidable organization they were in their heyday. The other New York crime families have experienced similar declines. The combination of RICO prosecutions, informants, and changing economic circumstances has diminished the American Mafia significantly. They still exist, still commit crimes, but their power and influence are fractions of what they once were. The Donnie Brasco operation wasn't solely responsible for this decline, but it contributed significantly to the erosion of trust and security that made organized crime vulnerable. Many of the individuals involved in the operation are dead now. Lefty Ruggiero died in 1994. Sonny Napolitano was murdered in 1981. Most of the other mobsters Pistone worked with have either died naturally, been killed, or are serving long prison sentences. The operation's human toll wasn't limited to one-side criminals died or went to prison, but law enforcement officials also retired with psychological scars, and families on both sides experienced trauma. The social clubs and neighborhoods where the operation took place have changed dramatically. Little Italy has continued shrinking, becoming more of a tourist destination than an actual Italian-American neighborhood. The younger generation of Italian Americans, by and large, have pursued legitimate careers, leaving behind the mob life that their ancestors might have seen as a path to respect and prosperity. The cultural circumstances that made the Mafia possible, ethnic enclaves, limited economic opportunities. Distrust of mainstream institutions have largely faded in modern America. The techniques and approaches pioneered during the Donnie Brasco operation have become standard practices in modern undercover work. Law enforcement agencies worldwide study the operation, learning from both its successes and its challenges. The FBI Academy uses it as a case study, teaching agents about deep cover work, identity management, and psychological resilience. Modern undercover operations against organized crime, drug cartels, and terrorist organizations employ methods that trace their lineage directly to what Pistone did: long-term identity assumption, careful evidence gathering, integration into criminal organizations. These are now understood as viable and effective approaches, largely because Pistone proved they could work. The psychological support systems for undercover agents have improved dramatically. Informed by what Pistone endured, the FBI and other agencies now provide mandatory counseling, regular psychological evaluations, and transition assistance for agents coming out of deep cover. The understanding that such work carries psychological costs that must be addressed proactively is now standard doctrine. The legal framework for undercover operations continues to evolve, balancing the need for effective law enforcement against constitutional protections and ethical concerns. Courts have examined questions about how far undercover agents can go in participating in criminal activities, where the line between infiltration and entrapment exists, and how evidence gathered through deception should be evaluated. The Donnie Brasco operation features prominently in these legal discussions. Technology has changed undercover work significantly since the 1970s. Nagra recorders that Pistone used were primitive compared to modern surveillance equipment. Digital recording devices can be made much smaller and more reliable. However, technology also makes undercover work more challenging. Digital footprints are harder to fake. Background checks can be more thorough, and the absence of a social media presence can itself be suspicious. The decline of traditional organized crime has led law enforcement to apply these techniques to other threats. Drug cartels, human trafficking networks, cybercriminal organizations, and terrorist groups have all been targeted using approaches pioneered during the Donnie Brasco operation. The fundamental insight that patient, long-term infiltration can gather evidence impossible to obtain through other means remains valid across different types of criminal enterprises. However, there's ongoing debate about whether deep cover operations like Donnie Brasco will remain possible in the future. Modern technology, increased surveillance, social media, and the digital trail everyone leaves make creating and maintaining fictional identities more challenging. The 6 years that Pistone spent as Donnie Brasco might not be achievable in today's world, where background checks can access databases across multiple jurisdictions and social media absence itself seems suspicious. Some law enforcement professionals believe that the Donnie Brasco operation represents a unique moment in history, a time when infiltration was possible at a level that may never be achievable again. Others maintain that adaptation is possible, that new technologies create new opportunities even as they close off old approaches. The debate continues, but everyone agrees that what Pistone accomplished sets standards that all subsequent undercover operations are measured against. Beyond the statistics, convictions, and operational achievements, the Donnie Brasco story remains fundamentally a human story about identity, loyalty, betrayal, and the costs of pursuing justice. It raises questions that don't have easy answers, questions that continue to resonate decades after the operation ended. What does it do to a person's sense of self to live as someone else for years? Identity isn't just a collection of facts about yourself. It's a lived experience, a way of moving through the world, a set of relationships and habits and mannerisms that define who you are. When Pistone became Donnie Brasco, he didn't just memorize a backstory. He inhabited a different identity so completely that it became part of him. Coming back from that, reassembling the identity he'd set aside, proved more difficult than anyone anticipated. Can friendship exist when it's based on fundamental deception? Pistone genuinely liked some of the mobsters he worked with, particularly Lefty, but every interaction was colored by the lie at its center. Was there anything real in that relationship? Or was it entirely false from beginning to end? Pistone has suggested that the emotional content, the genuine affection and concern, was real, even if the identity was false. But whether that distinction matters, whether friendship requires truthful foundations, remains philosophically ambiguous. What are the limits of what we ask law enforcement officers to sacrifice in service of justice? Pistone gave up 6 years of his life, his relationship with his family, his psychological well-being, and ultimately his very identity. He accomplished something extraordinary, but the costs were enormous and permanent. Is it ethical to ask someone to make such sacrifices? If so, what do we owe them afterward? These questions extend beyond the Donnie Brasco operation to all law enforcement work that requires personal sacrifice. How do we balance the rights of criminals against the needs of effective law enforcement? The techniques Pistone used involved deception on a massive scale, befriending people for the purpose of gathering evidence against them. Some civil libertarians argue this crosses ethical lines, that it represents manipulation that shouldn't be acceptable even against criminals. Others counter that organized crime's threat justifies extraordinary measures. The tension between these positions remains unresolved. What responsibility does society bear for the circumstances that create organized crime? The Mafia thrived in Italian-American communities that experienced discrimination, limited economic opportunities, and distrust of mainstream institutions. While this doesn't excuse criminal behavior, it provides context for understanding why some individuals chose that path. Breaking the cycle of organized crime requires not just prosecution, but also addressing root causes, something society has been inconsistent about doing. The Donnie Brasco story also raises questions about redemption and forgiveness. Lefty Ruggiero was a murderer who committed terrible crimes. He also showed genuine friendship to someone he thought was Donnie Brasco. Can someone who's done terrible things still have redeeming qualities? If so, what do we do with that complexity? The easy answer is to dismiss criminals as monsters, but Pistone's experience revealed that reality is more complicated. These questions don't have definitive answers, which is part of why the Donnie Brasco story continues to fascinate people decades later. It's a story about the complexity of human nature, about the costs of justice, about the psychological toll of deception, and about the difficulty of maintaining your sense of self when circumstances require you to become someone else entirely. Looking back across over 40 years since the Donnie Brasco operation ended, what can we conclude about its meaning and significance? The question demands examination from multiple perspectives: legal, psychological, ethical, and human. From a law enforcement perspective, the operation was an unqualified success. Over 100 mobsters indicted, dozens convicted, the Bonanno crime family devastated, and all 5 New York families weakened. The intelligence gathered provided unprecedented insight into Mafia operations, informing prosecutions that continued for years. The techniques pioneered became standard practice for undercover operations worldwide. By any objective measure of effectiveness, the Donnie Brasco operation achieved its goals magnificently. The psychological perspective is more complicated. Pistone accomplished something extraordinary, but paid prices that continue extracting tolls decades later. His identity, his family relationships, his peace of mind, all were damaged in ways that never fully healed. The FBI's psychological support systems improved because of lessons learned from what he endured, but that doesn't undo the damage. From this perspective, the operation succeeded but left casualties, including the agent at its center. The ethical perspective remains contested. Some ethicists argue that what Pistone did, befriending people for the purpose of betraying them, crosses moral lines regardless of how necessary it might have been. They suggest that certain forms of deception are inherently wrong, that manipulating human relationships for instrumental purposes violates fundamental ethical principles. The fact that the targets were criminals doesn't automatically resolve these concerns. Others counter that ethics must be contextual, that organized crime's threat to society justified extraordinary measures. They point out that the mobsters themselves used deception, manipulation, and violence as standard practices. Applying stricter ethical standards to law enforcement than to criminals seems backward from this perspective. Moreover, the alternative, allowing organized crime to operate without effective opposition, had its own ethical problems. The human perspective is perhaps the most valuable and the most painful. This wasn't an abstract operation involving faceless criminals and bureaucratic law enforcement. It was real people, flawed, complicated human beings on both sides, whose lives were permanently altered. Pistone sacrificed enormously and accomplished something unprecedented. Lefty trusted someone completely and was devastated by betrayal. Sonny Black lost his life. Dozens of families experienced trauma as fathers, husbands, and sons were arrested, convicted, or killed. Measuring success requires acknowledging all these dimensions. Yes, the operation worked. Yes, it damaged organized crime significantly. Yes, gathered evidence that would have been impossible to obtain otherwise. But also, yes, it extracted psychological tolls from everyone involved. Yes, it required moral compromises that remain uncomfortable decades later. Yes, it left scars on people's lives that never fully healed. Perhaps the truest measure of the Donnie Brasco operation's significance is that it forced everyone, law enforcement professionals, ethicists, the public, to confront difficult questions about justice, deception, loyalty, and the costs we're willing to accept in pursuit of law and order. Easy answers exist only if you ignore parts of the story. The complete story, in all its complexity, demands nuanced responses. In the 21st century, organized crime looks different than it did in the 1970s. The traditional mafia has declined significantly, though it hasn't disappeared. New criminal organizations, Russian mobsters, Albanian gangs, Mexican cartels, Asian triads, cyber criminal networks have filled some of the vacuum. The landscape has changed, but the fundamental challenges of combating organized crime remain. The Donnie Brasco operation's relevance persists because the techniques it pioneered remain applicable. Whether infiltrating a drug cartel, a human trafficking ring, or a terrorist cell, the principles are similar. Establish a credible cover. Identity, build relationships within the organization, gather evidence patiently over time, and extract safely caution while preserving prosecutions. The specifics change, but the fundamentals endure. Modern undercover agents studying the Donnie Brasco case learn lessons that transcend the historical moment. They learn about the importance of psychological resilience, about managing dual identities, about the warning signs of identity confusion. They learn about the necessity of having exit strategies planned from the beginning. They learn about the psychological costs of deception and the importance of support systems. They also learn about the moral complexity of their work. Pistones. Experience demonstrates that effective undercover work sometimes requires befriending people you'll eventually betray, witnessing crimes you can't prevent, making compromises that carry psychological costs. Understanding these realities beforehand doesn't eliminate the difficulties, but it helps agents prepare mentally for what they'll face. The operation also remains relevant to discussions about civil liberties and law enforcement powers. In an era of enhanced surveillance, digital tracking, and expanded government powers, questions about the limits of acceptable law enforcement tactics are more urgent than ever. The Donnie Brasco operation provides a concrete example for examining these issues, a case where deception worked, but also extracted costs worth considering before replicating the approach. For the general public, the story continues to resonate because it reveals complexity where people often prefer simplicity. We want heroes and villains, clear moral lines, easy answers. The Donnie Brasco story offers none of these comforts. Instead, it presents an FBI agent who accomplished something heroic while also experiencing identity crisis and guilt. It presents mobsters who were criminals, but also human beings capable of friendship. It presents a successful operation that also damaged everyone involved. This complexity is valuable precisely because it reflects reality. The world doesn't divide neatly into good guys and bad guys. People make choices in difficult circumstances, and those choices have consequences that ripple in multiple directions. Justice often comes with costs that aren't captured in conviction statistics. Understanding these realities doesn't mean abandoning the pursuit of justice. It means pursuing it with eyes open to its full complexity. The operation also speaks to broader themes about identity and authenticity in modern life. We live in an era where people curate multiple personas across social media platforms, where online identities may or may not reflect actual selves, where questions about authenticity have become philosophical obsessions. Pistone's experience of living as someone else so completely that he struggled to return to his original identity resonates with contemporary anxieties about selfhood and authenticity. Moreover, the story raises questions about loyalty that remain relevant in an increasingly disconnected society where traditional institutions command less automatic allegiance. Questions about what we owe to whom become more pressing. The Mafia's code of omerta was built on absolute loyalty to the family. Pistone's loyalty to law and justice required betraying personal relationships. Neither loyalty was simple or uncomplicated. Understanding the tensions between different forms of loyalty remains important for navigating modern ethical landscapes. Despite everything written about the Donnie Brasco operation, despite the books, the movie, the interviews, and the analyses, certain mysteries remain. Some questions can't be answered fully because they involve internal experiences that resist complete articulation. Others remain mysterious because the people who could answer them are dead or unwilling to speak. The deepest mystery might be what Joseph Pistone really felt during those 6 years. His accounts are detailed and candid, but even the most honest testimony has limits. The actual experience of being Donnie Brasco, while simultaneously being Joseph Pistone, the psychological reality of that dual existence, is something only Pistone fully knows. And even he might struggle to fully articulate it. Language has limits when describing experiences that fundamentally challenge assumptions about identity and selfhood. Another mystery involves what Lefty really understood about Donnie. Were there moments when Lefty suspected something was off, but explained his concerns away? Did he have doubts he never voiced? Or was he genuinely fooled completely until the moment of revelation? Lefty took this knowledge to his grave, and while Pistone has speculated, the truth of Lefty's internal experience remains ultimately unknowable. The question of whether the operation could happen again remains mysterious as well. Would modern technology make it easier or harder? Would contemporary criminal organizations be more or less vulnerable to such infiltration? Law enforcement professionals disagree, and the answer likely depends on specific circumstances that are impossible to predict in advance. The Donnie Brasco operation might represent a unique convergence of circumstances that can't be replicated, or it might be a template applicable to future operations. Only time will reveal which interpretation is correct. There's also the mystery of alternative histories. What if the operation had been discovered earlier? What if Donnie had actually been made into the family? What if different decisions had been made at crucial moments? These counterfactuals are unknowable, but they haunt the story, suggesting that success wasn't inevitable. That luck played a role alongside skill and planning. Perhaps the greatest mystery is the moral one. Was it worth it? Not in terms of convictions or operational effectiveness. Those are measurable. But in terms of human cost, psychological damage, relationships destroyed, was the operation justified? People can examine the same facts and reach different conclusions. Pistone himself has given nuanced answers that suggest he's still processing this question decades later. Maybe there isn't a definitive answer. Maybe the question itself is more valuable than any answer could be. Joseph Dominic Pistone is now in his mid-80s, living somewhere under an assumed name, still looking over his shoulder, still carrying the psychological weight of what he did over 4 decades ago. The $500,000 contract on his life has never been canceled, and the Mafia's memory is long, its sense of betrayal undiminished by time. He will never be entirely safe, never be able to live openly, never escape the shadow of Donnie Brasco. His accomplishment remains unprecedented in law enforcement history. No other agent has infiltrated organized crime as deeply or for as long. The evidence he gathered resulted in over 100 indictments, dozens of convictions, and the permanent weakening of the American Mafia. The techniques he pioneered inform undercover operations worldwide. By any objective measure, he succeeded beyond all reasonable expectations. But success is measured in many ways, and not all of them are captured in arrest statistics. Pistone's marriage survived, but was scarred. His daughters grew up largely without him, adapted to his absence in ways that changed their relationships permanently. His psychological well-being was damaged in ways that decades of therapy have helped, but not fully healed. The nightmares have decreased, but not disappeared. The guilt about Lefty persists. The identity confusion, while managed, remains part of his experience. Lefty Ruggiero died in 1994, broken and betrayed, never understanding how he'd been fooled so completely. Sonny Black Napolitano was murdered in 1981, killed for the sin of trusting Donnie Brasco. Dozens of other mobsters went to prison or died because of the operation. Their families experienced trauma that cascaded through generations. These costs are real and significant, even if we believe they were justified. The Bonanno crime family, never recovered its former power. The other New York families were also permanently weakened. The American Mafia as an institution declined significantly, though it never entirely disappeared. Whether this decline would have happened anyway due to changing social and economic circumstances, or whether the Donnie Brasco operation was a critical accelerating factor, remains debated. Most likely it was both. Broader trends were already weakening organized crime, and the operation delivered a blow at a crucial moment that amplified those trends. The story of Donnie Brasco, of Joseph Pistone, continues to fascinate because it contains so many layers of meaning. It's a police procedural showcasing brilliant investigative work. It's a psychological study of identity and deception. It's an ethical examination of justice's costs. It's a human drama about friendship, betrayal, loyalty, and sacrifice. It's all these things simultaneously, and the richness of its complexity ensures it remains relevant decades after the events it describes. For those who love true crime, the story offers an insider's view of the Mafia during its final powerful years. For those interested in law enforcement, it provides invaluable lessons about undercover work. For those concerned with ethics, it raises questions that resist easy answers. For those fascinated by human psychology, it demonstrates the flexibility of identity and the costs of deception. Whatever lens you examine it through, the story rewards attention. But perhaps most importantly, the Donnie Brasco story reminds us that justice isn't simple, that doing the right thing often comes with costs, and that the people who protect society sometimes sacrifice more than we can easily understand. Joseph Pistone did something extraordinary in service of his country and in pursuit of justice. He paid prices that most people will never have to pay. He made compromises that most people will never have to make. He lived two lives when most people struggle to live one. And he's still out there somewhere, living under an assumed name, carrying memories that define him, looking over his shoulder as he's done for over 40 years. The man who is Donnie Brasco can never entirely stop being Donnie Brasco, even though Donnie Brasco never really existed. That paradox, living with an identity that was false but felt real, having experiences that were genuine even though they were based on lies, is something Joseph Pistone will carry for the rest of his life. The $500,000 bounty remains active. The mob has long memories, but so does history. And history will remember Joseph D. Pistone as the man who did the impossible, who brought down an empire, who proved that organized crime wasn't invincible. He paid a price that can't be measured in money or counted in statistics. He lost parts of himself that can't be recovered. He sacrificed years with his family that can't be reclaimed, but he also accomplished something that no one else has matched. He infiltrated the Mafia more deeply than anyone thought possible. He gathered evidence that changed American law enforcement forever. He demonstrated courage, dedication, and resilience that set standards all subsequent undercover agents are measured against. Was it worth it? That question doesn't have a simple answer, and maybe it shouldn't. The complexities of the Donnie Brasco story, the costs and the achievements, the sacrifices and the successes, the darkness and the light reflect the complexity of justice itself. Sometimes doing the right thing requires paying prices we can barely afford. Sometimes serving a greater good means accepting personal losses that never fully heal. Sometimes the greatest accomplishments come with the highest costs. Joseph Pistone made those sacrifices, paid those prices, accepted those costs. He did what his country asked of him, knowing it would damage him, knowing he'd never be the same. That choice, made in 1976 and reaffirmed every day for 6 years, defines heroism as completely as any action could dot. So we remember Donnie Brasco, who never really existed, but whose impact was devastatingly real. We remember Joseph Pistone, who gave up his identity to serve justice and who has spent decades trying to reclaim what he set aside. We remember Lefty Ruggiero, who was a murderer, but also a human being who trusted completely and was betrayed absolutely. We remember all of them because their story, in all its complexity and pain and triumph, reveals truths about justice, identity, loyalty, and sacrifice that remain essential for understanding what we ask of those who protect us and what they give in return at the greatest lies, sometimes serve the greatest truths. Joseph Pistone lived the greatest lie in FBI history, and in doing so, he revealed truths about organized crime that changed law enforcement forever. He became someone he wasn't in order to expose who others really were. He lost himself so others could be found. He sacrificed his identity so that justice could prevail. And now, somewhere out there, an old man lives under an assumed name, watching the world go by, carrying secrets that define him, remembering the days when he was Donnie Brasco. He's still running from a contract that will never expire, still looking over his shoulder, still paying prices for choices he made over 40 years ago. But he did it. Against all odds, despite all obstacles, he accomplished the impossible. He was one man against an empire, and he won. The cost was enormous, the price nearly unbearable, but he won. That's the story of Donnie Brasco. That's the story of Joseph D. Pistone. It's a story of deception and truth, of betrayal and loyalty, of sacrifice and achievement. It's a story that reveals the complexity of justice and the courage required to pursue it. It's a story that reminds us that heroes pay prices we can barely imagine, and that the greatest victories sometimes come with the heaviest costs. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to this incredible true story. I hope it helped you relax, wind down, or maybe just escape into a different world for a few hours. Before you go, please hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow and allows me to create more deep dive stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new sleepy gangster story. What did you think of Donnie Brasco's story? Could you have done what Joseph Pistone did? Let me know in the comments below. And if there's another mobster or true crime story you want me to cover next, drop a suggestion. Share this with someone who loves Mafia history, true crime, or just incredible stories of courage and deception. Sleep well. And remember, sometimes the greatest lies serve the greatest truths. Forget about it.